Well, they say that some of the best strategies in public relations are those that you can't see, those that are that work in a mysterious way, but are nonetheless effective. And so when we come to thinking about the Republican movement and the activities it engages in, we're interested primarily in the question of what communication strategies are being followed, not in the larger question, which could, if we chose to go down that path, take us all day, of whether Australia, and as a New Zealander with a New Zealand even, should become a republic rather than a monarchy. And so we have two very good speakers with us this afternoon, James Mahoney and Sandy Blair, who's the CEO of the Australian Republic Movement. And I'm certainly very interested in how you've made decisions, Sandy, about which channels, which media, which other approaches have you found to be the most useful in promoting the Republican cause?
Yeah, well, thanks very much for having me along this afternoon. It's great to have a chat to you all and talk through this this important campaign. By way of background, for those that aren't familiar with the Australian Republic movement, we started in 1991 and we're the lead group that led the charge for an Australian Republic leading up to the 1999 referendum. And since that time, we've been campaigning for an Australian as our head of state instead of the British monarchy. And by head of state, I mean the ultimate authority in a nation, the most senior role in our constitution, which is currently given to the British monarchy by virtue of their birth rather than their merits. And so since 2016, we've been scaling up as a campaign and really starting to build out our teams and our presence across the country. And what we've seen, particularly in recent years, is a resurgence of support and interest in the campaign, not only because of the change of government. The change of government means that we now have a federal government that is much more interested in Australia becoming a republic and has appointed an assistant minister for the republic, which we've been lobbying for a long time. The passing of the Queen last year as well has renewed interest in the campaign, as has the recent coronation. And so we've really been scaling up in a really big way over this time. And we use quite a range of different channels to be able to reach out to people. But I think, probably the more important step before that is really doing the work, the research to work out exactly who we need to connect with, who our target audiences are, what's going to resonate with them, and how we can best reach them. And so one of the things that we've been doing in quite a systematic way over recent years is a lot of polling and research, both quantitative and qualitative polling, to really understand our target audiences better and where they're prepared to engage. And without going into the minutiae and the detail of exactly which demographics we're targeting and groups across the nation we're targeting, without giving that too much insider information away, I would say that many of the people that we're trying to reach are not engaging with traditional news. So they're not engaging with the mastheads, the main leading news stories, even the kind of TV, like commercial TV channels that are putting out the news each night. So while, for instance, generating a lot of traditional media coverage is helpful for mobilising many of our supporters to get involved in the campaign, in terms of delivering some of those key messages, the messages that are going to get across to people to get them over the line, to build support for the campaign, we're having to be and use channels that are much more targeted. Things like digital advertising through social media, working closely with stakeholders so that we can work with them so that they can put out the messages to their respective networks on our behalf, working with opinion leaders in different communities, and really thinking about how we can engage people using new media, but using targeted media that allows us to be really efficient in the way that we deploy the campaign. Like many campaigns, we've got really limited resources to work with, and you want to make every dollar count and every bit of your effort count. And so we've been really quite targeted and strategic about how we go about campaigning, which might mean for some parts of the community they don't see much from us at all. But that's okay because we're focused on that broader goal of winning a referendum and getting that referendum commitment from the federal government.
Thanks very much, Sandy, for that. I should first of all declare an interest that I'm a member of the ARM, which I think meets an ethical requirement for me. And I thought that your introduction was great for what I wanted to do today in chatting to you about your campaign. And I may touch on some of the points you made that you said, oh, I'm not really going to talk about them, but maybe you can give us a hint as we go. Sure. The first question that I wanted to ask you was what lessons you drew from the communication strategy for the 1999 referendum. From my perspective, I think that campaign was lost for political reasons, but there was also a communication campaign, and I suspect that you had a look at it before you designed the current one.
Yeah, well, I should say as well, a lot has changed since 99 in terms of the communication environment. You know, the way that we build communities, the way that we connect with people has changed a lot. There's obviously a lot more media diversity. There's, of course, social media and new media now. There's so many more voices in the conversation than there were back in 1999. So much of the approach in 99 was to work through those major news outlets to get them to try and carry the message for us and to get that out into the community. And so that was very top-down driven. It was driven by not just members of parliament who wanted to see that happening, and I'm thinking particularly of the Keating government, which wasn't in office during the referendum itself, but certainly put that referendum on the cards and put that train on the tracks heading down towards 99. But you know, also a lot of the communication was through traditional media that really wasn't connecting with the segments of the community that they needed to be able to. And that was, I should say, it's much harder to do that in 1999, to do that kind of targeted, focused campaign than it is today. There are many more options for being able to reach down deep and have those conversations with the people that you need to move and to identify exactly who you do need to move. There are many more options for that now than there were back in 1999. But from my perspective, I think that in many respects, the foundations for the failure of the 1999 referendum were actually set in the early 90s when the Keating government sat down with some of the key stakeholders, including members of the ARM leadership at the time, and they sat down with them and worked out what kind of proposal they wanted to put to the 1990 or to the referendum in the 90s, and they, between them, came up with a policy they thought was pretty good and then set out to try and sell that to the community. And so what we're doing differently this time, I think one of the key things that we learned from that is that in any proposal that's put forward at a referendum, you need to acknowledge that there are really three key groups that you need to be able to win support from. And that's your base of support, those who are already with you. And that's really who the 1999 referendum campaign focused on when they were coming up with their policy, like who was already with them, who supported them, what they wanted. But there are two other key groups, and that is members of parliament, because unless members of parliament support the proposal, you won't have a referendum. You can't have a national vote to change the constitution without their support. And thirdly, of course, the people who ultimately decide whether or not the referendum succeeds are Australian voters. And so when we were developing our proposal for change, and it is, from our point of view, a starting point for the conversation going forward, we actively consulted with all three of those groups to come up with our reforms and really kept in mind not just what were people's preferred reforms in terms of how we choose our head of state and what powers they have, but what they would actually vote for. And this is a really important distinction because if we just look at what they might prefer, then often that's just simply what they're familiar with. And sometimes, and often case in the context of our campaign, it was a range of different proposals that were never going to achieve majority support. And so in 1999, the entire period leading up to that referendum, they knew that they didn't have the support for that referendum to succeed on the basis of that policy. They were just hoping that it was just going to get over the line miraculously at the end of it. But where we've come from is saying we need to start from the grassroots up, understanding what the Australian public are prepared to vote for, understanding whether parliamentarians are prepared to back and what variation of that they're prepared to support, and then making sure that we can keep our base of support with us so that we can sustain the campaign through to a referendum. And so we've taken quite a different approach in the way that we've developed our policy, but also that leads to different outcomes in terms of the way we campaign and the kinds of people that we can attract to the campaign as well. With having a top-down driven approach, often you can only attract your limited base of support. With starting from reforms that reflect what the public are prepared to support, we've seen a huge influx of people from all sorts of walks of life, lots of different backgrounds, many young people getting involved in the campaign now. There are a lot of our young leaders, many of our young leaders are people who were born after the 1999 referendum. And so there's been a big generational change within the campaign. And that generational change has also allowed us to acknowledge some of those mistakes that we've made in the past and take a different approach as well. So some really positive change in recent years in that respect.
So that's kind of the background to the two bits of surveying that the ARM did. One was with the community, and you might explain just how you went about that opinion research. But the other is the work that you did with members of the ARM when you asked for them to come up with suggestions about what a model might look like. And picking up your point that you were after understanding what people would vote for, both those bits of research, if you can call the call out to members of research, both those bits of information came together to help you with your strategy.
Yeah, that's right. So to talk that through, so the policy that we developed, we called it the Australian Choice Model, and we developed it over the course of 2 years, over 2020 and 2021. And we recognised, again, that for a referendum to succeed, we needed to get our base of supporters behind us, parliamentarians behind us, and the broader public. We could survey many of our supporters because they're involved in the campaign and get an understanding of who or the positions that our most dedicated supporters would take. But to get a better understanding of what the public were prepared to support, we had to go out and do a range of quantitative polls. So each of those polls had a sample size of just over 2,000 people, enough to get a good read and to drill down a little bit. But it is really important to understand the limitations of drilling down too far with a sample size even of 2,000 people. And in the past, we'd actually done some benchmark research with sample sizes of over 6,000 to allow a bit more fidelity in terms of some of the cross-tabbing. And by cross-tabbing, I mean breaking down within segments and getting a better understanding of some of those segments within the research that you do. So we did some quantitative and qualitative research up front, compared that with the broader public, and then compared that to the survey results we'd received from our supporters. We were consulting with members of parliament throughout the process and other key stakeholders, then worked with an expert panel of 10 constitutional law scholars, some of the best in the country, who also consulted with their colleagues to really put the meat on the bones, develop the policy further, come up with a proposal that was really constitutionally sound, and that would strengthen our constitution, and that would deliver an Australian head of state chosen by Australians in step with what the information that we'd received from our consultation with the broader public. In addition to all of that, as you mentioned, James, we also opened it up for public submissions, and we received over 1,400 written submissions from the community, which was quite a number, considering that that's a lot more than most parliamentary committees get in terms of the reforms that they often consider. And then after bringing all of that together, weighing it up, a lot of iteration between, for instance, what the expert panel we had assembled were recommending. They would make recommendations to our national committee, who would consider it from a policy perspective, weigh up all the data points and consider what might be best overall for the campaign. and a lot of back and forth there to finesse that, to get that to a point where it was a cohesive policy that we could release publicly. And before we did that, we also conducted some further quantitative polling to make sure that through that whole process, we hadn't lost sight of what the public was still prepared to back and whether they would be prepared to back that final proposal. And so one of the key takeaways from that was that if you ask people, for instance, their support about a republic and, do you support a republic, yes or no, you'll end up with one figure. But then when you present them with a range of different options, you get very different responses for each. So there's very little support, for instance, for the Prime Minister choosing our head of state. Bit more support. Well, they don't trust the Prime Minister to choose our head of state, particularly given that the head of state is meant to be a constitutional check and balance on our system. And so there's a little bit more support. You get to see support in the 40s for the Parliament choosing our head of state, and that's essentially the proposal that was put forward in 1999. Yes. There's about the same level of support for direct election, where anyone can nominate, anyone runs, and everybody, and then you have a ballot paper potentially with 1,000 names on it or a few hundred names on it to choose from for head of state. But people had reservations about that because they were worried that someone might be able to buy the election, or that you end up with a long list of candidates that aren't necessarily suitable for the role in that. But then when you start to bring those together and come up with some hybrid approaches, for instance, where Australia's parliament, state, territory and federal, develop a short list of robust candidates, people who are really suitable for the role, and then those are put to the public for a vote, then you start to see support well into the majority, and you start seeing support shift not just from undecided voters into the yes column, but from those who would traditionally oppose a republic as well. So when you break down those numbers, there's only about 10% or even less than that, about 8% of the population that is opposed to a republic in all instances. And there's a large part of the population that is prepared or was open-minded to at least one form of a republic. And then there's a good 50% of the population, and in recent polls are showing a bit higher than that, in fact, that support a republic, but even their support can be somewhat conditional. So again, it's really important to look at how you can thread the needle between those three key groups to come up with a proposal to take that forward.
Bringing all that together to, design your communication strategy, I suspect that some of the additional issues that you needed to address in that were things like apathy. Oh, I don't really care, it's not broke, let's not fix it. The timing for the debate to actually start leading up to the referendum, and then how we're going to measure what we do between, say, now and when there is a referendum, which is looking like, if Albo gets up again, it's going to be in the next term. The impact of the 1999 result, which you've touched on the chances of success, who the opponents are and what they're likely to do, and the complicated, what I thought a bit of a complication, was the death of the Queen and the coronation. So did you sort of have to massage all of that into how you decided where you were going to go and the message and so on?
Yeah, it's really critical in that there's some things that you control, some things that are predictable, and some things that you just don't know when they're going to happen. So, an example of something that is predictable is parliamentary terms. And really, our window of opportunity for the campaign sits within the Labor Party, for instance, has a formal policy in favour of a republic. So do the Australian Greens. The Liberal Party doesn't have a position one way or another on a republic. And generally the split is slightly more favourable towards a republic than not, but some notable voices against a republic, like the Leader of the Opposition, Peter Dutton, for instance. And so parliamentary terms are an important timeline for us and what we can achieve within those parliamentary timelines, depending on who's in government over that period. And so, for instance, in the last period of government, we recognised that the federal government wasn't going to bring forward a republic vote during that time under the coalition. There just wasn't the support from the Prime Minister, for instance, to bring that forward. So we recognise that there was an opportunity there to prepare for and lay the groundwork for a referendum in future years, so that if there is a change of government like we saw last year, then that opportunity, that window of opportunity opens up, and we're ready to hit the ground running and have a credible alternative to be able to start campaigning for in the broader community. In terms of your question about opponents, look, in many respects, and don't say this too loudly, but the more the monarchists talk, the better it is for us, because they're helping to keep it on the agenda and get people talking about it and thinking about it. And for an issue like this, being on the agenda is sometimes one of the hardest things. And so one of the, we saw last year with the passing of the Queen, huge outpouring of positive sentiment towards the monarchy at that time, and a lot of, I think, quite justified sentimentality towards the Queen and what her reign meant for people. But coming through to the other side of that, it only took a few months to see the polls start moving back in the complete opposite direction and in a really strong way. So we saw, for instance,
did the coronation impact on that movement?
In a really positive way as well for us, which was really interesting. So during for instance, the morning period last year, there were a number of polls taken when there was almost 2 weeks of wall-to-wall coverage about the monarchy, about Queen Elizabeth and her reign. And during that time, support for the monarchy increased quite predictably. But then by Christmas, there are a number of polls starting to say that support for Republic had shifted back in a much stronger way and was in a much stronger position than it stood before the Queen passed away. And then through to the coronation this year, we're now seeing polls published in the mid to high 50s. And in fact, one was even showing 60% support for a Republic off the back of that. So people are seeing Charles as our new king, saying, I don't like the idea of Charles as King of Australia. I think it's time for change. We had the end of an era with Queen Elizabeth, and now it's time for us to have this conversation, have this debate, and we're seeing more of those conversations now happen across different media outlets, not just on the ABC, as you might have caught, but there's a much more of an openness for a conversation. And we're also seeing thousands of people now sign up to get involved in the campaign, and much of that is happening organically. We do a lot of acquisition advertising, targeting different groups we know are more likely to support a Republic, and encouraging them to get involved and track those metrics quite closely and work on getting them more involved as members and volunteers and donors to support the campaign. But we're also seeing a lot of organic support where people are proactively seeking us out to get involved now and get involved in the campaign. And there's a real change in tone now, where perhaps before there was a reverence towards the monarchy. A lot of that has now been lost, and people are starting to quite openly criticise the monarchy in a way that we haven't seen before. And so that's a really different dynamic.
That brings me to a point that I was going to ask a bit later on, but you've in a sense raised it now. And that's the commentary on the website. From our personal interactions, you'll know what my personal stance is about some of that. But I wondered whether the ARM is actually concerned about some of the rather, personal is the best way of putting it, commentary about the King particularly, and the other royals. Some of it's quite bitter. And I'm just wondering whether that really is appropriate for that website when we've still got a lot of undecideds and people who are just opposed to a republic, to convince that it's not going to be an earthquake, it's going to be a reasonable and rational transition with minimal change to our system of government. Is that concern fair income, or am I being a bit overly cautious?
Well, I think if we go back to first principles, and I should say for the benefit of others on the call as well, the page that James is referring to is a Facebook group, and that Facebook group allows people who have joined the group, and there's thousands of people in that group, allows them to post content that they think is relevant. And it's really an opportunity for supporters of a republic, not just those in the ARM, but outside the ARM as well, to express their views about a republic. And some of that is quite critical of the monarchy, and certainly it goes beyond what, for instance, we would publish as a campaign or what we would endorse as a statement on behalf of the campaign. But I think it is really important for people to be able to express those views and to share their perspectives on the monarchy. And for different people, it means different things. But the other thing I'd say about that group as well is you're really talking about some of the strongest dyed-in-the-wool supporters of a republic as well. And they're the people that are in that group having that conversation. And that's an important, that group creates an important space, for them to have that conversation and to learn from each other and to test their arguments and to speak to each other in that way. But that's quite different from, for instance, what you see on our public Facebook channels or other social media channels, or the kind of advertising that we do or the statements that we make in the media. And that is important to get that nuance right, to understand that perhaps what might resonate for your base of supporters, the people who are most committed to your campaign, is quite different. And for us, it is quite different to what necessarily is going to cut through to those people that we need to persuade to get behind us so that we can win a referendum.
Before we go on, I must remind people who are on the webinar that if you have questions for Sandy, use the Q&A function, and hopefully someone will notice that you've raised a question and we'll pose it to him. You mentioned earlier on that your specific target audiences were, you didn't say secret, but you didn't want to talk rather loudly about them. But I assume that there's a quite heavy concentration on young people, those who are already electors and those who are coming up to being electors, which opens up a whole range of strategic approaches from the digital media stuff to, I'm wondering, education campaigns in schools or via the education system itself. Are you doing a bit of that?
Yeah, so in fact, we've been able to give presentations to, for instance, education unions and other teachers' forums to help start the conversation even at that level so that they can have the conversations in their classrooms. We have quite a number of teachers who are involved in the ARM as members and as supporters, and they're working as well to make sure that there's a balanced presentation of that, of the arguments for a republic and discussions about the monarchy in the education system. But also, as you say, look, yes, targeting young people is a focus for us, and we are targeting even the 16 plus in that respect, because we recognise by the time a referendum is held, they will be of voting age, and this is a decision that they'll be asked to make. But at the same time as well, what we've also seen, particularly in recent years, as it's increased as a focus for us, we've seen significant increases in support among the under 35s and under 25s in particular as well. So we're seeing now a significant generational change coming through. And our challenge for them is not so much even trying to sell the finer points of the reforms that we've developed, but raising awareness about the fact that the British monarchy is still Australia's head of state. And that's pretty shocking for many of them to actually find that out. They've grown up watching the news, seeing members of parliament and prime ministers, leading the country, but not fully appreciating and understanding that behind that is the Governor General, the King or Queen's representative, and the monarch themselves as our head of state. And so the first step really is raising awareness. And once we've raised that awareness, the next step of persuading them that they should support the change isn't that hard for us, because for them, the idea that anyone would inherit a role as important as that by virtue of their birth, rather than their ability or their merits, it's really out of step with their values as young people. And there was a poll as well published just prior to the coronation as well that actually found that 66% of Australians, so 2/3 of Australians, said Charles's personal values were out of step with theirs. And among young people, that increased to well over 70%. I think it was about 3/4 of those aged under 25 that said that Charles was out of step with their values. And so for any monarchists out there that were hoping that Charles's environmental credentials or his advocacy in that space was going to win over the youth vote, they'll be sorely disappointed with those results that they're seeing.
Yeah, and one of the things that complicates the issue generally is confusion about what a head of state is and what a head of government is. And without wishing to thrash the website, you can see a bit of that on the website where people think the PM's the head of state.
Yeah, and again, I should say that we're not talking about the Australian Republic Movement website per se, but the Facebook group. And again, like the group provides a good opportunity for people to share their thoughts and educate each other about the way our system of government works. It really doesn't get taught in schools. Like there's really, when we look at Australia's civics education system, it's really quite abysmal. I think there's an ACARA report, the Curriculum Authority report published a year or so ago that found that only about 2% of the Australian curriculum was dedicated to civics education of any kind. And so many students come out of high school not even realizing that Australia has a constitution. And so they're given the bare basics to be able to go and cast a vote and not much more. And so again, our role is to educate the broader population to increase awareness about the way our constitution works, about the role of the British monarchy and their representative to Australia, the Governor General, about their role in the constitution, and how we would be better served with having an Australian as our head of state who's accountable to us and representing our interests instead.
In the context of the broader electorate, is there a group of people that are regarded as intractable who are not formal monarchists? I'm just thinking of a bunch of people in my age group, for example, who older people might say, "Oh, what's the point of it all?" Is that a sort of a correct assumption, or does that sort of intractability go right across the demographics?
Well, there are very few Australians that are so set in their views that they wouldn't be open to at least changing their mind. It's only about 10% of the population that are in that category of being rusted on opponents, for instance, to a republic. But there are efficiencies in the way that we can campaign. And as many of you on the call would appreciate, it's much easier to create an idea in someone's mind than to change someone's mind. And so for us, again, a big focus is to raise awareness in the community, to try and get that conversation happening with them as soon as possible so that we can plant that seed to get them thinking about constitutional change and thinking about how things could be improved. And so next time they do hear something about, for instance, the British monarchy, then that's part of their thinking in the way that they're receiving that information and discussing that. So it's not so much that we're completely ignoring certain segments of the population, but also appreciating that in terms of getting support to where it needs to be, our time is better spent on those that don't have such a firm opinion one way or the other, and that are approaching it new for the first time, because they're the people that are genuinely open to finding out more about the campaign and finding out about what the changes would mean for them.
And have you planned for a change in the direction of the strategy when it gets feverishly close to an announcement that there'll be a referendum, and for when there is a referendum? Do you see much changing, or will the messages and message delivery pathways and tools change it much, or will you just sort of keep going and perhaps more intensity and stronger messages?
Yeah, look, I think it's a constant evolution. And that's why we, for instance, conduct regular polling, regular focus groups to really make sure that we're constantly refining our messaging to make sure it's in step with public opinion as it shifts. And look, I think another time that our campaign, we've just been through a round of it recently, but another time to do that will be next year following the voice referendum, depending on which way that goes, because that will, in many respects, change the debate in Australia about our national identity, even in many respects. There'll be a lot of discussion about the Constitution over that time. There'll be much higher levels of awareness about the way referendums work. And so that may prompt or justify a slight changing in the way that we go about, particularly our awareness raising campaigns. That may prompt a change in that respect and justify that. But I think also, the closer we get to a referendum, the greater resources we'll have at our disposal to run more widespread advertising, going beyond those key target demographics, and starting to broaden out the conversation to really ensure that we don't miss anyone in that conversation, and we give everyone the opportunity to consider the issues that we're asking them to consider as part of a referendum.
To use a Donald Trumpism, some people are saying that the outcome of the voice referendum will impact heavily on whether or not a government is prepared to bring on a republic referendum, given the history of change via referendums in Australia. What's your view on that?
Well, I think if we take the words from the Assistant Minister for the Republic at face value, and I've got no reason to think otherwise from the more private conversations that we've had with him, he said, look, a referendum on a republic will be more difficult if the voice referendum fails. It's not to say that they wouldn't necessarily bring that forward, or that a republic would be off the agenda if the voice referendum fails, but that if you've already been through one referendum campaign and it hasn't succeeded, then there will be a little bit more of a reticence, a bit of a once bitten, twice shy approach from the government to bringing forward another referendum. And so that really just puts the impetus back on us as a campaign as well, to make sure that public support is strong enough that we can continue to say to the federal government, regardless of whether the voice referendum is successful or not, that we can continue to say to the federal government, yes, it's time for this conversation to happen. The support is there in the community for this. A referendum will succeed, and here's the best way to go about doing that. So we have to be able to build that confidence among the federal government for them to take this forward, win or lose in terms of the voice referendum. But certainly, I think it'd be fair to say that there would be if they've already succeeded with one referendum, then there's they'll have the wind in their sails and be more open to bringing another one forward sooner rather than later.
You mentioned earlier that you'd been doing a bit of work in the Federal Parliament House to convince politicians to the cause. Are you able to hazard a guess at what support there might be?
Yeah.
And as a sort of addition to that, is it going to be the loud trumpets in the opposition, loud because of their positions, like the leader of the opposition, that are going to thwart the effort?
Well, I think we can take it as given that there's going to be opposition to this change. There are some people who feel very strongly about it. There are monarchist groups that are organised to campaign specifically against it. And so we're not going to be able to get to a point where there's just a unanimous support from across the parliament or the community for this change. We are going to have to make the case for that change, but we have got really good support in the federal parliament at the moment. 2 months ago, we launched a parliamentary friendship group for an Australian Republic, and it's our co-conveners, that group. We've got one from the Liberal Party, one from the Labor Party, and an independent as well, co-convening that friendship group. And that really shows the cross-section of support that we have across the parliament, including members of the Greens, for instance, as well, and other Teal independents that have expressed their support. So we keep a close track of which members of parliament support a republic or yet to declare their position or are opposed to it. At the moment, there's 66% support in the parliament. So if you bring together senators and members of the House of Representatives together, 66% of the parliament support a republic. Only 10% have declared their opposition to a republic. And so in some ways that reflects the kind of harder numbers that you see in the broader community as well, if not slightly more in terms of actual declared support for a republic. So we've got a really good base to work from there in terms of having that federal parliamentary support. And we've seen numbers, for instance, even within the coalition, start to move our way in recent years as well. and an openness there. So again, the Liberal Party doesn't have a position on it. They leave it up to individual members, which provides an opportunity for us to be able to mobilise noisy voices, in our column as well, and to counter some of those. So there's other more vocal opponents.
Is there a contingency plan to handle Clive Palmer's squillions of dollars if he's against a republic?
He's actually for a republic,
Hey!
so that one's not a concern so much. Yeah.
So he could send you squillions of money for the campaign.
Well, look, I mean, what I would say about that first and foremost is we're a non-profit, and we're powered by the donations and contributions of our members who come from all different walks of life, across the country. So we're not reliant on philanthropic donations. They have their place in campaigns where people can get behind causes they support. But look, I'm not expecting any donations from Clive Palmer. Certainly not in the next couple of years.
And
I think he's got enough battles of his own on his hands at the moment.
And before we let loose the hordes of people who must be wanting to ask a question, I just wondered about your consideration of the noise around the debate and what you're doing. It seems at the moment the monarchists have been very quiet. They've had a few interventions, but they've been very quiet. When do you expect them to get involved?
Well, they are trying to make some noise, and we certainly keep an eye on what they're up to quite closely, because we can try and preempt that or even leverage that at times to our advantage. But look, they've appointed Erica Betts as their campaign spokesperson, which in my view is a bit of a gift to us. So thank you, monarchists, if there's any listening at the moment from the Australian Monarchist League. But look, they are trying to get into the debate, and again, all power to them in terms of doing that. But what we do have to keep an eye on is there has been a history of misinformation coming into the campaign, and people trying to mislead voters about, or it's beyond actual misinformation. We're talking about disinformation often in the campaign, where they're trying to push people off track or create fear or doubt or uncertainty in a way that's completely unjustified and isn't backed up by the facts. So like with all contentious issues, it's something that we're having to be conscious of and trying to be proactive in making sure that, for instance, journalists and other media are informed about what they're reporting on and have the facts at their fingertips when they need them.
Sandy, Sue Jin asks, are you also considering new citizens as your target audience, or those who became Aussie citizens recently? They'll be new to voting in Australia, and not all of them may know what to think about and who to vote for or what to vote for. Have you thought about how they might be helped out?
Yes, in many respects, it's a similar approach to the one that we're having to take with some of the younger voters as well, in terms of raising awareness about our constitution, about the role of the British monarchy, and about the way that they can make change through a referendum, and why it's important to make that change. But for many multicultural communities, they can see that having a British head of state can't represent them or their interests, can't be the kind of representative that they might aspire to be for the nation even. And if we really do believe in being a modern democratic nation that gives everyone an equal opportunity to hold high office in the country, that gives everyone an opportunity to represent our nation, then really we need to make this change so that we become a republic and with our own head of state. And so we are certainly working very hard in those communities, and that's a particular focus of our chairs at the moment as well, Craig Foster, who's had a lot of involvement in multicultural advocacy, Vic Def, and a number of others on our national committee who've been involved in multicultural communities across Australia. That's a big part of their advocacy, not just in raising awareness, but in countering misinformation and introducing them to the campaign.
Here's a tough one. Christine asked, what's wrong with Erica Betts as a spokesperson? Why is that a gift to the ARM?
Eric Abetz is a very polarizing character. We often find that after he's had public appearances, we have people proactively contacting us to say, look, I've just heard Eric Abetz on the radio or on the TV, and I'm more persuaded than ever that we need to become a republic. So how do I get involved? If I could, I might just leave it at that, but let's just say Eric Abetz isn't the kind of person who's going to resonate well with people who are yet to make up their minds in this campaign.
And there's one that sort of goes a bit on to the argument for a republic, which I think we'll just ask because it'll be interesting to hear your answer to it. How do you manage with apathy? Citizens who don't think a change will affect them or mean anything.
Apathy comes from people not having enough information to consider the issue, essentially. So when people find out more about the way that our constitution works, about the role of the monarchy and the Governor-General in our constitution, about the fact that both of them have the power to veto laws, that it's up to the Governor-General who becomes Prime Minister, that it's not simply who wins the most number of seats in the Parliament or has a majority there, but it's actually up to the King's representative, the Governor-General, to determine who becomes Prime Minister. When you start informing people about those facts, then they start to care about it because they realise that it matters and that it's important. And it's important that we have a constitutional check and balance who can keep our Prime Minister and Cabinet in check when they're moving outside those constitutional requirements. And so at the moment, the King's representative to Australia, the Governor-General, is appointed by the Prime Minister, or appointed by the King, I should say, on the recommendation of the Prime Minister, and the Prime Minister can remove them at any time. So you don't have that independent check and balance that our Constitution deserves. That is meant to be a centerpiece of our Westminster system of democracy. That's not present there at the moment by virtue of having an absent head of state who lives on the other side of the world and has a representative to Australia, like an ambassador to Australia instead. And so the first step to overcoming apathy is to start informing people about the way our system works now. And so then they can appreciate, they can make a judgment call even on whether they think that's appropriate right now with our current system. And so once we've presented that problem, those dilemmas to them, then we can start to have that conversation about a better, more positive alternative that will strengthen our constitution and improve the way that our country is governed.
And you've already said, I think today, that once you provide that information to people who don't understand or just apathetic, you've already seen the changes in the polling.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So even the simple act of raising awareness helps to move things our way. And I've got no doubt that with the Queen passing away last year and the coronation this year, that has also served to help raise awareness about the way our system of government works, and has, as a result, actually helped support the campaign for a republic.
Yeah. Here's another tough one. It goes off our pathway a bit. What's the social good of becoming a republic, and how will that help Australia's most disadvantaged?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think it really comes down to representation, and making sure that we have a head of state who's going to speak up for Australia and our interests all the time, and that everyone is equal under our constitution, that you don't have to be born into a role to hold high office, that anyone, regardless of how what your background is or what the circumstances of your birth were, that you should be able to aspire to be Australia's head of state and get to that point, but also to be able to choose people for that role and hold them accountable if they're not standing up for you in your interests. So at the moment, by virtue of having the British monarchy as our head of state represents the interests of 14 other countries in addition to Australia. They can't get out there in trade delegations, for instance, and put Australia first. They don't. They put the interests of the United Kingdom first. And so if we, for instance, had other representatives, like members of parliament, for instance, who are out there advocating for other countries' interests, I think we'd be pretty quick to get them out, of the parliament and say, that's not on. It's possibly, it was certainly a conflict of interest, but possibly worse than that too. And so the same argument goes for our head of state as well. If we had a head of state who's out there actually advocating for Australia's interests, fighting for trade deals, fighting for economic opportunities for the country, holding the Prime Minister and Cabinet accountable for in relation to constitutional matters, and having a stronger constitutional system that improves our government, then that helps all Australians. And we'd start to see the benefits of that. So not just at a moral level in terms of equality, and in terms of everyone having a fair go under the Australian Constitution, but in terms of economic and other political and international relations opportunities as well, to improve Australia's standing in the world.
Excuse me, thanks very much, Sandy. I'm running out of voice, so other people can have a shot in a moment. I just wanted to make one comment, which I think is really terrific about the ARM. It's great to have a communication professional as executive head of the organisation, and that doesn't happen very much. And we've got Sandy, who's got a master's degree in strategic communication. He's worked in a lot of communication jobs, and so he's one of us who's running a very important organisation. So thanks, Sandy, for your contribution today and taking up so much time with us. And I'll just hand back to Chris.
I think thank you very much, James, and thank you. I add my thanks to you, Sandy. It's been a fascinating discussion, and particularly impressive that the ARM has been able to sustain a campaign and a cause over such a period of time. We know well that in a day of supposedly instant solutions, people find it easy to give up when the going gets tough. But you guys have been going and making headway. So on a personal note, I wish you very well in doing that. And on behalf of all the participants today, thank you both very much indeed for an genuinely illuminating seminar. And so thank you very much.
You're most welcome. Thank you.